will be opening the floor for questions. For those who are here this morning, the simple house rules are as before. As you approach the microphone, before you ask your question, kindly share your name and affiliation, and then keep your question or your comment as short as possible so that we can accommodate as many questions or comments as we can. Okay, and then we will try to have several questions first before asking our speaker to respond. Thank you. Okay, feel free to ask.
I'd like to know what you make of the, I guess one of the recent developments, Xi Jinping just organized a new leading small group on military affairs, and there seems to be an attempt there's this debate between China, party leadership over the army, that's being emphasized recently. So how does this, both internal army party issues or issues internal to the PLA itself be driving some of this?
I'm Gayden Plus with the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies. You titled this lecture as The Power of Enemy. May I ask whose enemy?
Ambassador Villanueva.
About the century of, or 1 century of humiliation, a mantra of the Chinese that has been developed by the state. The victimization syndrome that seems to fuel Chinese nationalism, which is very much needed considering that especially the youth of China are not easily attracted to ideological considerations like before. Now, I just want to know what the connection is between the Hawks and this concept of century of national humiliation. Is it only the Hawks that are stoking this idea? And if so, does this mean that it will not be effective? But the fact is, it seems to me, it is not just the Hawks that are responsible for this, but it's very much ingrained and in fact institutionalized in different centers. Like they came up with a center that was specially targeted towards Japan and its record. The maritime records of comfort women, etc. So, could you please enlighten us on this? Thank you.
For me, I think that my reading of party priorities is that the party leadership of the military is the #1 issue, and that political imperative has to be refreshed regularly. And so, forming a leading small group is another way of enforcing and maintaining political diplomacy as well as I mean, it may be, I haven't followed the details, but I mean, there are clearly issues, domestic issues in terms of military budgets. Who's going to get the budget? We're going to cut spending on people and spending more money on hardware. Are we going to professionalize further? How are we going to upskill the army? I mean, they're aware how technologically lacking they are. So there are hard choices ahead. So maybe this is about focusing the mind and pushing things forward. I mean, often you only realise how far the Chinese military had to go when they announced some kind of development. Last year there was a story, I think in the PLA Daily, someone drew to my attention about how from now on the Chinese Liberation Army are going to have realistic wargaming exercises. You think, well, what have you been doing for the last 50 years? And apparently what they've been doing for the last 50 years is that they have a script in their military exercises. And then one side always goes like this, and the other side always goes like this, and this one does this, and they fire that, and then everybody goes home. You know, and then now they were going to have some unpredictability in their exercises. Like we did this before. You know, plus there are huge issues with corruption in some of the Chinese military, and waste of units that don't exist, claiming expensive, all that kind of stuff. So maybe it's about where you can control some of those issues as well. I don't know what it is. Who is the enemy? Well, I mean, historically the enemy has been anti-communist forces within China, within the one China, i.e. Taiwan, and so on. But I suppose more generally it reflects on the region as a whole. But in terms of the specific use of enemy work, it generally refers to anti-communist Chinese the authorities of Taiwan. In terms of the ambassador's question on the link between the Hawks and the Century of National Humiliation, I mean, I think they operate firmly within the discourse of the Century of National Humiliation. That's what provides the background to all of this rhetoric, way of thinking, ideology. Recently we were just talking about at lunch the opening of the new exhibition in the Museum of Chinese National History on the Century of National Humiliation. And it's quite a large museum, it goes over 2 floors. And basically the purpose of it is to show how the imperialist powers came along, ripped up China, humiliated the country, and then it was saved by the Communist Party in 1949, and which basically sort of wiped away most of that sin, and then the regaining of Hong Kong and Macau, was a great victory for the party, and there's obviously still unfinished business. Now, if we try to unwind that history, it seems hard to do that without also unwinding the legitimacy of the Communist Party. If you're saying that that isn't the whole story, or if there's more to the story than that, or if you remind the Communist Party that 20,000 people were killed in the Opium Wars by British and their allies, that doesn't really compare very well with the 20 million people who were killed in the Taiping Rebellion 10 years later. Why have you failed to mention the Taiping Rebellion in your narrative of national humiliation? And there's other things. How many the politics of that century of humiliation, how Chinese leaders were at times implicated in it and played one side against the other, and all the other bits which complicate that simple narrative. And if you're saying at the end of it that actually, and by the way, the South China Sea isn't yours either, in effect it's hard to do that without telling the Communist Party that they're not necessarily the right people to run China, which is quite a hard message for them to accept, obviously. So this is, I think, the problem is that they've got themselves into a position where their performance as a ruling party, they almost said, judge us on our performance on this issue. And if they don't perform on this issue to the satisfaction of people and their reputation and their legitimacy as a person, so it's important.
Dr. Rivera.
I just wanted to confirm exactly what was your position on the so-called votes. Are you in effect saying, because you ended with by quoting from a position by General Yu, who obviously doesn't belong to the so-called office factor. Are you in effect saying that the votes represent a marginal element of communist politics right now? I mean, in the leadership, or is it in a more sophisticated sense, does it represent some kind of a deliberate strategy where you combine, as it were, using your quotation from Sun Tzu, an attempt to deliberately weaken the enemy, whoever that enemy is? And And in the context of also your last slide, I was wondering if you have an opinion about how the Philippine response to the conflict, in particular two responses, the filing of the memorial for the arbitration panel, and what will now soon be formalized as the so-called enhanced defense cooperation with the U.S. Do you have any idea how that kind of response would further affect the conflict over the South China Sea? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera from the Department of Political Science.
I'm Adriana Mestre from the Asian Center, and I grew up here watching BBC as a child. My father loved BBC, so I'm delighted. My question is more on the journalism aspect, so there are no silly questions, right? Okay, for the afternoon session, I'm interested in how you were able to collect all the data from all these Chinese personalities. Did you have somebody who spoke Chinese, is Chinese, collecting all this data from a journalist point of view? Is there like maybe a clique or a group of you BBC journalists, maybe you have like all these post-its or a map on the wall connecting all these people? I'm just interested in the backstory behind the data of your second session this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Layton, maybe you can respond rapidly.
Thank you for the question. Yes, I believe that the role of these hawks is a tactical one. I believe that they are one of many tactics that the military political leadership can deploy in its struggles to both maintain control within China and in foreign policy as well. I'd actually, the general I quote up there would formally have been regarded as a hawk in some ways, because the kind of things he has said publicly in the past might lead you to that conclusion. But he also has a more senior role now, and he seems to be sort of pretty much the apex of the military leadership. So his call for everyone to calm down, I think, you wouldn't see as the authentic voice of the military. And he was no longer playing this game. But, I mean, the hawks still continue to appear in the media. They haven't been silenced. From time to time, there's been issues about whether they're allowed to have Weibo accounts, whether they should be sort of tweeting in effect about these things. But that's often been a sort of party war about whether party members should be tweeting. And they've been fairly obedient in terms of when they should tweet and when they shouldn't, and that kind of thing. But they haven't gone away by any means. They're just used selectively. And I wonder whether that connects possibly with the answer to the question about the Philippines response. I mean, I think there might have been a realization in China that a number of actions that China has taken in recent years have had a counterproductive effect. The fact that the Philippines is signing this enhanced defense agreement is clearly a response to a sense of threat in the Philippines. So if the overall Chinese aim was to try to make this part of the world more reliant upon China and put it more into a Chinese sphere of influence, then they've clearly just failed, or they've just made their job harder by pushing the current leadership of the Philippines into a closer military relationship with the United States. So maybe someone in Beijing is saying, whoa, we've got to roll back, let's not do any more to make the situation worse. And I think you can see evidence of something similar happening over the last year and a half or so, because a lot of the incidents that took place in the sea in 2011, when Chinese vessels were cutting the seismic cables of oil survey vessels, when there were incidents involving Chinese fishery protection vessels and things like that. And that's the reason I got that much in the book, because things were pretty hot in 2011. And the response has been to pull the different Chinese agencies, like the Fisheries Law Enforcement Command and the China Maritime Surveillance and some of the others, under one heading of the China Coast Guard, and trying to sort of rein in, because they realised that a lot of these actions were counterproductive. So each agency was trying to defend its own agenda, but the overall impact in China was negative. So I think they took a decision to create the China Coast Guard, pull these agencies into line, and stop the provocations in a way, just trying to calm down the situation. So yeah, I mean, you could say, and what's interesting is that, to my mind, as far as I know, there hasn't been a response to either the filing of the memorial by the Philippines or the impending defensive agreement. I mean, wouldn't it be hard for the flow of Chinese tourists here to be interrupted, or for there to be more problems with, banana exports or whatever? These things have both happened in the past. So why aren't they happening now? Why, as far as I'm aware, the Philippines is pushing ahead with its agenda and is not getting any kind of negative comeback from China as I listen to things. So there's been this blockade of the Marines on the second on the shoal, but even when the Filipino ship managed to get through a couple of weeks ago and deliver supplies, there was no response. Nothing. Just as an adjunct to that, I wrote an article 3 weeks ago in which I argued that the Chinese leadership placed a greater priority on maintaining that blockade than on hunting for the missing Malaysian airline. Because when the plane went down, people still thought it had gone missing somewhere between Thailand or Malaysia and Vietnam. Chinese Coast Guard had at least 2 vessels doing the blockade of the second on the shoal, and had another couple of vessels over on the Scarborough Shoal. They could easily have been sent to the search area, and they could have got there a whole day and a half quicker than the ones that were eventually sent from Hainan Island. But the Chinese Coast Guard chose to keep those ships maintaining the blockade of seconds on the shoal rather than send them to look for the missing Malaysian airline. Imagine if the plane had gone down and there was a bunch of people clinging to a life raft somewhere in the South China Sea. Then in fact the Chinese government sacrificed those hypothetical people in order to maintain the blockade of seconds on the shore. But my overall point is there has been no comeback, as far as I'm aware, to the Philippines' moves. I think that the memorial is an incredibly smart move. I think there's nothing in it that anybody who wants to criticise the Philippines can criticise it for. It's about the peaceful resolution of disputes, it's about maintenance and regulation of international law, it's about all the things that people like to talk about when they talk about resolving territorial disputes. The problem is that it backs China into a corner in the sense that if the tribunal agrees to hear the case and decides that it has jurisdiction, in my view, it's almost certain that the Philippines will win on every single count. There's no way that some of the features that China is occupying can be considered to be islands capable of supporting human habitation. So Scarborough Shoal is incapable of supporting human habitation. It's a rock. Maybe it's really a couple of rocks. So therefore, it doesn't have an exclusive economic zone. It only has a 12 nautical mile territory limit, and the same with the Chinese control of occupying features. Which means that even if, in the overall game, if all territories are awarded to China, they'd still only be able to draw 12 nautical mile limits around those islands, which means everything in between those 12 nautical miles either becomes part of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone or becomes part of the high seas, subject to a further decision about territorial ownership. So, and that then allows Philippines energy companies to get on the drilling on the Reed Bank, Recto Bank, and then if the Chinese try and stop them, then the Philippines can waive this judgment at them and say, look, the law is on our side. So I think it's a clever move. The problem is that, of course, it's not the Chinese Foreign Ministry that makes foreign policy often. It's some combination of the Foreign Ministry, the military, the southern provinces that have a large fishing industry, the offshore oil company CNOOC. These are all institutions that have an implemented policy in China, and the Foreign Ministry is relatively junior among them. So the Foreign Ministry at the moment is desperately looking for alternative strategies in case it loses this case. Hence, they're looking at questions of can they revive particularly odd bits of international law that talk about historic rights, historic title, historic waters, and see whether they can use those as legal arguments back instead. So that at the moment seems to be the response of the funding of the Memorial One, I think practical and damaging to the Philippines economy. I suppose it is quite surprising that there hasn't been that kind of pressure. But I suppose maybe relations between the Aquino government and Beijing and were so bad, it's hard to see how they can get into those. Journalism, right. The great thing about journalism is that you allow to use other people's sources. I mean, I couldn't have written this book if I tried to do it on my own. I don't speak Chinese, but I know people who do, basically. And so a lot, I make no bones about the fact that I'm a middleman. There have been lots of academics who've been getting their fingers dusty in archives, and I've been talking to them and reading their work and bringing it to a wider audience, and hopefully giving them sufficient credit for where they've done the work. So if people like Andrew Chung, David Shamble, people who spend, and other institutions, there's a think tank in Washington called the 2049 Project, which looks a lot at Chinese intelligence and sources. So it's a bit, you have to be in the same way as an academic is skeptical about sources. You have to think, why is this person telling me this? Are they telling me the truth? Are they spinning me a line? Have they considered all the sources? But then after a while, once you've kind of read enough of the stuff, some things start to make sense to you, some things seem less credible. So I fully admit to, as I have done here, relying on Andrew Chubb's work and other people's work. But I think academics need to get out there more, and journalists are already out there. So I hope that by showcasing Andrew's work on this, that hopefully it's going to be a bit more recognition and people will start to have a more sophisticated understanding of what's going on here. So it's not my own work, I'm afraid. I'm afraid this isn't the BBC paying for this research. This is my freelance activity, and I'm making use of lots of academics' work, which I hope will have a knowledge for you.
Hi, sir. Good afternoon. I'm George from the Philippine Navy. There's a Chinese strategy called three warfares, which involves the legal, psychological, and media warfare in order to advance their interests. My question is, what is your take on this Chinese three warfare strategy and on how they use it in the East China Sea and South China Sea disputes? Thank you.
I would like to ask your opinion about how the Chinese are also exploring other avenues in affecting opinion, like getting foreign experts from the West, foreign academics actually, to write articles that find their way into academic journals. So that's a different arena altogether, which is quite new to me, because the articles speak directly about the issue, about territorial boundaries, etc. These other things. Okay, and then, ma'am,
Okay, this morning we had a lot of discussion, a very good discussion on cartography, but I was waiting for this psychological warfare. According to this announcement, he will also examine how Chinese media employ psychological warfare strategies vis-a-vis the Philippines and the United States. Being a BBC journalist, was China successful, or is this normal?
All those questions kind of fit together, don't they? Yes, I mean, there's three warfares. Political, psychological, legal. So this is political warfare. So this fits firmly within this, and is firmly within the overall structure of winning without fighting and laying the groundwork. I mean, one shouldn't pretend, this also relates to your question about other strategies used by Chinese side to influence opinion. I mean, we shouldn't think that China is the only country that does this. I mean, obviously, Fulbright scholarships, East-West Center scholarships, all these kind of institutions are, I mean, they may not consistently write nice things about the United States, but they are there to encourage, links between foreign academics and the United States, so that, in general, I suppose, a positive view of the United States is created. And the US has experts in, public diplomacy, and the French has the Alliance Française, the French cultural. It says, yeah, Britain has the British Council, Germany has the Goethe Institute. Every country has ways of trying to make people around the world think that they're a nice country. And scholarships is all part of that. The problem, I guess the problem for China might be if they approach this in too clunky a way and start offering people money to write positive articles, then it's going to come out, it's going to backfire very quickly. There's already been some bad publicity about Confucius institutes around the world, and whether they are academic institutions or propaganda institutions. So there is this suspicion of what China's up to. But China has spent large amounts of money, millions, on developing competitors of BBC World and CNN for CCTV's international arm. And a lot of the time it's quite good stuff, and their coverage of Africa is probably at least as good, if not better, than BBC and CNN, which are trying to sort of play catch up. And they have that because obviously China has decided that Africa is a place it wants to influence, wants to cover. They don't have to worry about advertising to pay their costs, and so they can invest a lot of time and energy in covering Africa parts of the world. But if you watch China Central Television, you'll see there's a big difference between bits of it that are produced in Washington or other places, and then at certain times of the day to get the Beijing view, and there's sort of a man who's clearly a sort of party apparatchik, with their coat over hairstyle when it comes to using the Chinese perspective. And then you can see the difference in the kind of clunky Chinese approach. This is our propaganda, and the sort of more kind of free-flowing general journalism that they have at other times of day. And I guess that's, they are learning slowly their political propaganda, warfare, public relations, awareness raising, whatever you want to call it, will become more sophisticated in time. And I think that, that reflects also about how successful they are in terms of, their journalism in this question here. This hasn't been an overall study about Chinese media output. I haven't kind of looked at Chinese media output in the round to kind of see the range of opinions that get voiced. I specifically wanted to look at what are taken to be expressions of Chinese nationalism and ask how genuine they are. And come to the conclusion that in this case, in these examples, this expression of nationalism is intended with political strategy. It doesn't mean that I think that all Chinese nationalist expressions on the South China Sea are fake. I think there is grounds for opinion, but I think that it's deliberately used as a tactic in this discussion, in this issue. It's part of the overall political strategy.
More questions? Yes, Janice.
My name is Ronald Kevin. I was just wondering how valid an observation or theory would it be to suppose that the BMA as an entity with the CCP has always struggled to gain legitimacy and credibility among its own people, because the history of the CCP has always been fight for legitimacy among its own citizens. There has not been much talk about a Chinese conflict with India, or the long conflict with Russia for quite some time. And China has been so preoccupied building its blue water navy since the early 80s. Careful at the same time, I suppose, careful not to rile its neighbors too much or scare them, as you said, deeper into the arms of the United States or the other Western powers. Because I think the recent developments have shown that if China pushes too hard, Japan just might change its attitude against its no-war policy. And I think the current government of Japan is restudying the possibility of recrafting its language such that Japan would be able to build up its own power over again. So I think China is, being careful about that. On the other hand, in its struggle for legitimacy and credibility with its own territory, do you suppose it would be valid to do you think it would be valid to suppose that the PLA, through its hawks, is trying to get legitimacy and credibility and significant relevance within the Politburo, given that they have allowed the economy to prosper and using the profits of that economic prosperity to build its military and using now this military to gain credibility? Do you think it's as certain as the bill is that the PLA and the CCP would fool its own people and gain and preempt the rhetoric on democracy and change it to nationalism instead of the Beijing democracy movement? I'm just trying to look at the links whether the PLA is trying to preempt the rhetoric on democracy within its own people and say there is a higher rhetoric in nationalism.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Harold from UP Asia Center. I was just wondering about how do you think this will hold true, given that a few years back, Martin Jacques wrote in his book, China the Superpower, it will not necessarily pursue the prototype used by former superpowers such as the United States and others. How do you think this will hold true given psychological warfare and given all the political and social pressures that it faces right now? Do you really think that China will still dig away from that prototype? Thank you.
Do we have a third question? All right, maybe I can follow up on my own question. Okay, my earlier question was actually connected to the recent writings of Professor Talman from University of Bonn, right, who's a legal scholar, and I'm just wondering how, I'm curious about your opinion about how China thinks of this as a strategy to get Western legal scholars to affect Western opinion in these matters. Thank you. Okay, so 3 questions. Mr. Maitland, you can now respond.
I mean, the question of links between the PLA and the Communist Party obviously is very, it's difficult to interpret because it's so secretive and there are lots of what used to be called criminology, kind of trying to work out who stands next to who at parades and all that kind of stuff, who has influence. But I think in standing back, it's clear that a lot of the struggles within the Chinese bureaucracy are about funding and access to resources. Very academic John Garber, a long time ago, wrote a paper about the People's Liberation Army Navy in the South China Sea. He called it the confluence of bureaucratic and national interests. And I think you can use that term to describe a lot of what goes on. And the fact that Siemens, the oil company, was able to spend $870 million building a deep sea oil platform to go and drill in the South China Sea. Well, how did they get access to that money and the subsidies? Presumably because they could use the language of nationalism to say we are going to defend the interests of the nation in the South China Sea, and you have to fund the sacred duty in the same way the military can make a case for funding by saying we are defending the country's territory, and if you don't support us, you have to disloyal, the country will be weak, blah, blah, blah. In the same way that fishing organisations that really basically just want to go and fish can also say we are defending the country's countries claim to the mainland China. So I think lots of internal lobbies within China use this nationalist rhetoric, this nationalist argument in order to bolster their bureaucratic domestic funding position. And we're locked into a situation where nationalism is becoming an enabler for resources to be unlocked in China in a way that is kind of hijacking policy from below, perhaps, and it's very hard for the centre to take a view of policy which sees everything around. Although maybe the things I mentioned before about reining in some of the agencies suggests that the centre might be about to is taking control. The question of sort of Martin James' approach on China rules the world. I think in some ways what's happening is reflects a loss of confidence in the West, in Europe and North America. It's a sense that the model has run out of steam, the economic, political, social model, which you can find in lots of ways in terms of, for example, changing attitudes to the European Union, the sense that people are being left behind. But I'm also convinced of the superiority of the Western model as we used to be, particularly in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And I think sort of people, a lot of people like Martin Jacks maybe have kind of freaked themselves out by looking at China's, the statistics on China's rise and just extrapolating, that if you have a country that grows as quickly as this, then it's inevitable that it's going to end up ruling the world or whatever. But they haven't, I think this approach isn't sufficiently empirical. It's clear certainly from a military perspective that China is an awfully long way away from ruling the world. And there are enough counterpoints of view about the state of the Chinese economy, its internal indebtedness and that kind of thing, as to whether its growth is going to be sustainable in the long term. It's obviously going to be a major player in the world. Is it going to rule the world? I'm sceptical, to be honest. I think it would be that, I think people were saying the same things about Germany in 1910. I'm not suggesting we're about to go to war with China. But there was an assumption that because the economy was growing so rapidly that it would end up dominating the world. Well, it didn't turn out. It cost millions of dead people to prove that point, but it didn't turn out. And so I think you need to take a kind of a sceptical look at a lot of these predictions, because I think that we're kind of lying, we're sort of rolling over too quickly and just thinking the game is over and we're going to be speaking Chinese within a decade or so. This isn't supposed to be a sort of cry of, let's all unite and gang up on China. I think it's just, we have to really take a hard look about what's actually, what's really going to happen, and look at some empirical data rather than assuming that this curve is just going to simply carry on going in the same rate into the future. For example, everybody used to think that the United States was going to be dependent on Middle Eastern oil, and that was going to be its Achilles heel. Well, these days, ever since October last year, China now imports more oil than the United States, and it comes from the Middle East. And China is going to start facing the same strategic choices about its attitude towards the Middle East as the United States has done for the last 50 years, and is busy trying to educate itself on through things like producing shale oil back home rather than importing Saudi oil from abroad. So lots of things are changing. The Chinese economy has got an aging population, population growth is slowing down, the American economy is going in the opposite direction. So, who knows how these things might pan out. I think when we stand back in 10 years' time, we will see this as a period that probably began with the financial crisis in 2008. Certain voices in China thought this is the moment, overreached themselves, caused a backlash in the region, which is we're in the middle of right now, and made things tense for a while. And then there was a sobering up process when the world came to realise there's a difference between what we say and what we do. And hopefully we'll go back to a kind of a state debate based on the UN Convention on the Sea, turned into towards more arcane debates about historic rights, historic time, historic waters, which are all slightly different terms of international law. But the thing I've read is he swallows the whole historical argument that seems to be that the sea has been China since ancient times, it's mentioned in hand manuscripts, all this kind of thing, all of which a skeptical historian would just rip to shreds. I'm afraid there's going to be two quite short answers. On the textbooks, I tried to look into this because I heard it mentioned, and it obviously seemed to be a strong line of argument. But I decided it was going to take a long time from being in China and actually checking the textbooks and going through them line by line. And the problem was made even worse by the fact that different provinces have different textbooks. And then trying to reach an agreed consensus about what Chinese textbooks say, I decided I would wait for an academic to go and do the work and eventually get the second edition. So, I mean, there has been, as you know, a debate, and there was a Chinese academic who, 5 or 6 years ago, described Chinese textbooks as we are drinking pools. He said, we are sort of bringing up these children, to learn to hate because of the way our textbooks are written, which I thought was a fantastic quote, and I'll explore it. But he wasn't specifically talking about the South China Sea. He was talking about issues with Japan, just general misconceptions of history, glossing over internal problems in Chinese history, always blaming foreigners for problems. So he was talking about the general. I mean, he got basically denounced and forced to sort of recant that. So it's a good example of how textbooks are controlled, but unfortunately, obviously, by South China Sea, it's fine. There's probably stuff to be done there, but I didn't do it. And I didn't know anybody else who'd done it. On the China Association, all I can do is direct you to David Chamble and people like Project 2049 Institute. They're the people that have looked at these influencing operations, and they're the people that think that it's linked to the General Political Department, or the liaison department of the General Political Department of the PLO. But I imagine they have a mixture of military intelligence and people, and party people, and presumably they're not going to tell you that they are intelligence